It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. The price of one Bitcoin is trading at about $118,000 at the moment, and demand for the digital currency continues to climb. Bitcoin ATMs allow people to buy the digital currency using cash or a debit card. According to one Bitcoin ATM map, there are about 580 of these ATM kiosks in Wisconsin to make crypto transactions. But scams related to Bitcoin ATMs are also on the rise. Wisconsin's Department of Financial Institutions is putting in place new guidelines set to take effect this month for Bitcoin ATM operators. To learn more, we have Paul Nyland, an associate professor of taxation in the Department of Accounting at UW-Whitewater. He's also the faculty director of its Blockchain and Cryptocurrency Institute. And Preston Cherry is here, an assistant professor of finance and personal financial planning at UW-Green Bay, where he directs the Charles Schwab Center for Personal Financial Planning. Paul and Preston, welcome to you both.
All right. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Paul, let's start with you. Before we get into the scams and the regulations, how do these Bitcoin ATMs work?
Yeah, so these are...
Oh, Paul,
I'm
sorry. We just lost you there for a moment. Your internet cut out. Start again, please.
Oh, can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Great, yeah. So, yeah, by my count, there's something like probably 40,000 of these ATMs all over the country. And yeah, they take physical cash, and you have to plug in your own public Bitcoin address, which is not a problem, and that convert that money into Bitcoin. So in theory, there's nothing really wrong with Bitcoin ATMs. It's the scams that affect kind of every industry, like medical scams or insurance scams. Similar people, calling people who are vulnerable in certain situations and depositing cash, but then sending it to the wrong address. That's essentially what's happening. So it's unfortunate, but obviously as Bitcoin gets bigger and becomes more valuable, like any asset class, you're just going to see a rise in scams.
Preston, can you walk us through some of these scams? What are some common things coming up, and how are Bitcoin ATMs in the midst of these scams?
Well, I think the BTMs are Bitcoin vending machines right now. I mean, the ease of access. I mean, ATMs, right, have had consumer protection for decades, and we're still seeing high levels of scam activity. And BTMs are very new. They're in elementary stages. And even with Bitcoin and crypto still at its new stages. So just imagine the scam activity that's going to go on with these machines at the early stages. Some of the scams could be convenience spreads or transaction spreads. So one Bitcoin could trade at a high level, or trying to get your Bitcoin out of the machine, and it's kind of like a foreign exchange spread. All right, just like Western Union, so to speak. I mean, you're getting money out of there. What's that spread? What is it? So that's one example of a scam.
Paul, are these Bitcoin ATMs regulated differently than the bank ATMs that we're so familiar with and have been in place for decades?
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. So there's traditional ATMs have been in place forever. They have a separate set of rules. And I think the not legislation, but the Division of Banking rules that have been promulgated by the state of Wisconsin is, I think, trying to put some of the same types of regulations in place that, are traditional ATMs on Bitcoin ATMs. And you see it when you look at the rules. Essentially what it does is it tries to put more onus on the person or the company who's got the ATM there, right? And so it puts more liability on that person to make sure their customers are not getting scammed. So it's in the infancy stage, I agree. But it's going to be impossible to weed this stuff out permanently. The same way we see, wrench attacks happen at traditional ATMs for decades.
Preston, one of these policies being put into place are daily transaction limits. A BTM operator may not accept or dispense more than $2,000 of cash per day per customer in this state. What What do you make of that particular policy?
I think it's a good policy right now. Just like ATMs. I mean, you're trying to protect the consumer against him or herself, number one, and then those that are trying to take money out of their account for cash is concerned. Now, look, cash has has a it's number one on stability, right? So there's no volatility. Now, even more so for Bitcoin and other crypto coins, there's a lot of volatility
Mm-hmm.
in these areas. So having a protection against or for having a cap of withdrawing, I think is more so advantageous than cash, because there's no volatility in cash, but high volatility in coins on a daily basis.
We're talking about these Bitcoin ATMs or BTMs in Wisconsin as new regulations from the State Department of Financial Institutions go into effect on Sunday. And we have Paul Nyland from UW-Whitewater, faculty director of its Blockchain and Cryptocurrency Institute, and Preston Cherry, an assistant professor of finance and personal financial planning at UW-Green Bay. Paul, how can consumers using these Bitcoin ATMs keep themselves safe from fraud? What should they be looking for?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I think showing up with any amount of cash, I think you have to step back and just say, like, how safe is it to walk around with any amount of cash? Um, and so I think there's just sort of best practices about not carrying around more money than you're willing to lose. Does it really make sense to carry around $2,000 or $10,000 of cash at all times? So I think some of the sort of financial hygiene, if you will, just has to do with kind of best practices you would take even outside of Bitcoin machines. So I think obviously there's lots of other ways, and I think better ways to buy Bitcoin. As was mentioned earlier, you can buy places with much smaller spreads, far less in fees, smoother transactions through your own bank. So I mean, I think of the Bitcoin, the BTMs as being, an option, but it has all the same sort of risks like normal ATMs would have. It doesn't make sense to have a lot of cash on you at all times. You're really setting yourself up for a lot of physical attention that you probably don't want.
I want to turn our attention now to Congress, which passed the country's first major standalone crypto bill, President Trump signing the Genius Act into law Friday. Preston, in part regulating a type of cryptocurrency known as stable coins at the federal level. Can you talk about this particular new law and stable coin and how it's now regulated?
Well, I like this stable coin being given a little bit more stability. I guess that's a pun. I guess being 100% backed by some treasuries and 100% backed by cash, and not allowing for hopefully some future debacle, like past failures of over leveraging some of these coins and over promising some of the delivery of these coins. As we know that some of the altcoins, one or two of them, it's not a signal for all coins, but we had some of the large stories that coins were worthless after being highly levered, thousands of percents over and over, and then the coins being worthless. So when you have a promise, quote unquote, of a stable coin, as the word says, then having legislation saying, okay, we have the full faith of the cash or a T-bill, I believe it's a step in the right direction.
Paul, I want to get your take. Is the Genius Act a sea change in the U.S.'s stance towards these digital currencies?
It is an absolute sea change. I think when I look at the entire legislative landscape of crypto and Bitcoin, I think we'll look back probably 10 years from now, and this will be a line in the sand. The reason for this is because if you go back to the prior administration in the SEC, the normal way in which the SEC would regulate cryptocurrency organizations or exchanges is through lawsuits. And so there's dozens, hundreds of stories you can read online where an exchange like Coinbase or Kraken would say, "Hey, we just want rules in place so we know how Congress or the government expects us to operate with our clients. And for the longest time, the SEC refused to provide any guidance and said they would just outright sue them. So they would sue Kraken and sue Coinbase, and the idea was that they would get rules out of lawsuits. So this is taking a more practical approach, I think, and saying, hey, let's sort of end the position of creating rules by lawsuits. Let's just do it through legislative action. And so this is the first step. It's on stable coins. Stable coins are a massive market, a staggeringly massive market. Not in the US, which people might not realize, but across the world, because people in other countries want to operate on US dollars because their own currencies are devaluing too quick. And so using the US dollar as sort of a medium of exchange in, say, Argentina, there's huge demand for these stable coins. And so oftentimes you don't see people in the US using a lot of stable coins because we just have access to the actual dollars. But in other countries, it's huge. And so I think giving these exchanges that are mostly located in the US clarity on how stable coins can work abroad, it's going to probably drive the industry up, another 10x or something. It's significant.
Preston, final thoughts, turning to you in Wisconsin here. What are you watching for as cryptocurrency continues to have new policies and regulations here in our state? What are you watching for?
Yeah, I'd like to hear Paul's thoughts on this, but I find it a little bit comical I don't know if that's a soft word, but we had the decentralized finance, and one of the biggest themes is that the pushback against traditional finance, and now we're having some reversion back to the mean in both of them, actually. Traditional finance accepting some decentralized finance, and now decentralized finance being more normalized, quote unquote, by accepting some of the more TradFi ways of governance and the like. So there's a little bit more. It's kind of funny that way, ironically, that both of them now are reverting back to the mean in order to support one another.
Well, Preston Cherry and Paul Nyland, thank you so much. Preston Cherry at UW Green Bay, Paul Nyland at UW Whitewater, as we talk about new policies in Wisconsin for cryptocurrency. Coming up on Wisconsin Today, a new book charts the rise of solar power and how it's become the fastest growing form of energy in the world.
Solar's not on the margins anymore, just happening in a few innovative countries. It's happening around the world. It's becoming a big part of global electricity supply.
The Wisconsin author of How Solar Energy Became Cheap. That's next on WPR News. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. In 1957, you could generate a month's worth of electricity for the average American home using solar panels for around $300,000. Today, you can generate that same amount of electricity using solar panels for about $25. That comparison is in a new book that charts the rise of solar energy and how it's become the cheapest, most efficient power source in the history of the world, even in places that aren't particularly sunny. PV panels convert sunlight into electricity. So how did they get so cheap, and what will it mean for the future of our power grid? Greg Nemeth is a professor in the La Follette School of Public Affairs at UW-Madison. He is the author of How Solar Energy Became Cheap, Pathway to a Solar-Centric Economy. Greg, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Thanks, Kate. It's great to be here.
So the first edition of your book comes out in 2019, exploring how solar energy became so affordable. Why did you see a need to update the book?
I wasn't sure there was a need, but as I looked closer, the progress that's happened in solar in the last 6 years has really been dramatic, and it's really changed the way the solar future looks. So we've had adoption of solar is about 4 times what it was 6 years ago. The costs have dropped by 75%. And we've seen an array of other changes as well. And so it really shifted the focus of the book to not only update the data and get everything up to date, but also to think about the implications, which is now what happens when solar takes over the global energy system, which it looks like it's headed to do.
So 75% price drop. You quote the International Energy Agency referring to solar as now the cheapest way humans have ever made electricity and as the cheapest form of electricity in almost all countries. How cheap is cheap?
Well, electricity, the cost of electricity has been falling over the last 100 years, and it's been rare to have a new technology to come on and undercut what fossil fuels have been giving us over the last 100 years. And so now we have it. And so now we have electricity that was, if you had the first solar cells that we put on satellites in 1958, it would have cost you $300,000 a month to power your home with it. Whereas now, if you just think about the solar and cost it, it's something like $30 or $40 a month for the electricity. So it's come down a lot, but it's also cheaper than the alternative. So that's what's really driving solar and makes it exciting to think about what could happen next.
And yet it still costs roughly $30,000 to install solar panels on a home here in this country. And that may not be affordable to most families. What do you make of that?
Well, the here in this country is a key part of what you just said, because in the U.S., solar costs about 3 times what it would cost in other developed countries with similar wages like Australia and Germany, where that $30,000 system would cost $10,000. It's still a substantial expense, but that's on the level of a furnace rather than on the level of a car. And so if we could make some of the changes to the U.S. so that we could pay what the rest of the world is paying for solar, I think we'd see a lot more adoption than we already see.
You say set our eyes on Australia, which followed a model in its use of solar. Rather than building large solar farms owned by utilities, it rapidly installed rooftop solar on homes. About 40% of homes there have solar panels. How did they do that?
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and that's a new story that wasn't in the book in 2019 because it hadn't happened yet. And Australia is interesting because it's a big exporter of fossil fuels, of coal to China, of natural gas to the rest of Asia. And despite that, they really made a big push on going with solar for electricity provision. And it's been things like making the installations really simple and streamlined. You can get a solar panel or a solar system installed in your house, and it comes with a guarantee that they'll do it in one day. And that dramatically reduces the cost. And it's also subtle things like how permitting works and delays with getting the solar installed. All of that is much more turnkey in Australia, but it came from some policy decisions at the national level to say, we're really going to do this. This is the direction we want to go. And there was strong social consensus that we want to take advantage of the low cost, the reliability, not having to rely on fossil fuels, and then the air pollution and climate benefits that come with more and more solar. It's a sunny place, but we have sunny places like that in the U.S. as well. And so it really provides a model for what places like the U.S. and others could do. And it's really pushing on residential solar rather than these large utility scale projects, which is more of what we've done in Wisconsin.
I've learned, too, through your book about this history of how so many countries pitched in on the innovation and advancements of solar. Germany did this, and Japan did this, and U.S. and China and Australia. Is that what is unique here about solar's playbook, that its origin story is not just one place in the world?
Yeah, I think it's pretty distinct because people always want to say who did it, and no one country did it. It was really this kind of relay race where, to simplify the story that you were outlining, I say that the U.S. created the technology, Germany built a market, and China made it cheap. And there were some other countries that played a role as well. But each of the countries that was involved, say 6 key countries, they contributed something distinct, some know-how or some way of developing policy or developing innovations, and each country was able to build on the other. So it really was the product of this global innovation system. And I think that's kind of the magic of what made it really work so well, is that there were contributions from lots of different places, and now we have availability to do solar in lots of different countries and states, and that is what we're doing today.
I want to pick up on that. How widespread is solar becoming around the world? And then where are the gaps?
So now we've got about 7% of global electricity is coming from solar. And then if you put all energy together, like think of energy that goes into fertilizers and into cars, solar is about 3% of that. And depending on your perspective, that seems like a lot to me, having seen solar be not even 1% for a long time. And it's also a number that's doubling about every 3 years. So you start taking that 7% and doubling that every 3 or 4 years, you get to pretty big numbers very quickly. In fact, by the time you get to the mid-2030s, you're at about half of electricity supply. And so that's the big change that's happening. Solar's not on the margins anymore, just happening in a few innovative countries. It's happening around the world. It's becoming a big part of global electricity supply. And it's being deployed in places that we wouldn't think of being on the technology frontier, like Pakistan has been a big adopter of solar in the last couple of years because the electric grid is so unreliable and because they can get cheap panels next door from China. So we're seeing that happen in lots of different places. And it's interesting because those are different types of places. They have different amounts of sunshine, different electricity systems, different levels of income. And each of them are doing it a little bit differently, but some of them are getting up to really high levels. Like Australia, we already talked about. Chile's gone up above 20% of its electricity, and others are marching forward as well. So it is really a global phenomenon that's happening, and it's in a much bigger way than I saw 6 years ago when I did the first edition of the book.
Taking this to Wisconsin then, in 2022, solar accounting for about 3% of Wisconsin's power generation, according to the State Public Service Commission's assessment. It accounted for less than 0.1% in 2015. Is that the typical kind of growth that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, that's exponential growth to go from that tiny number in 2015 to what you said in 2022. And now we're at something like 5% of electricity. That's rapid growth. And I think that's also something that I was noticing when I did the first book in 2018, 2019, and there was kind of big projects being proposed in Wisconsin. I remember thinking, really? We're doing big solar in Wisconsin? I've been seeing it happen in the Middle East and the southwest of the U.S., but that was a sign of things to come. And so that's been happening more and more in our state. So now we're up about 5% of electricity. It's a little bit behind the rest of the U.S., which is about 7%, but it's not too far behind. I think the distinct part about solar in Wisconsin, though, is it's really been utility scale solar that's driven it and not as much residential scale, which in a lot of other places, Australia is a good example, we're seeing a lot more rooftop solar. And so that's probably where the bigger opportunity is for our state.
Why do you think the utility scale solar is excelling in Wisconsin versus rooftop?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not completely sure. I would say one reason is that for a while it was really difficult to do what's called third-party financing. So when you buy a phone, you often pay for it over 2 years. You buy a car, you pay for it over 5 years. So there was ways of doing that with solar where you would actually lease the system from a third party, which would lease it for you. And that was kind of tied up in the courts for quite a while. And I think that's put a chill on the residential sector. So getting some of the rules straightened out, getting the permitting very streamlined, and that'll help the installer community get mature and efficient at installing solar. And I think that's a roadway for us to get to more solar on rooftops, because we're a little bit less than 1% of all homes in Wisconsin have solar, and that's behind where the rest of the U.S. is.
We're talking about how solar power became so cheap and efficient. Greg Nemeth is the author of How Solar Energy Became Cheap, Pathway to a Solar-Centric Economy. Greg, as you talk about U.S. inventing solar technology, Germany creating markets for it, and China making it cheap, right now you quote that the world's PV modules have, basically China has become more and more of the producer of these modules. Is that where the market for manufacturing remains? And then thinking about that in the context of a trade war, what's going on?
Yeah, that's a hot issue right now. It has been for a while. The first tariffs on solar were put in place by the Obama administration in 2010. So it's been a trade war for a while, and it's also become more concentrated in China. And that's actually a surprise to me. But from where I was in 2019 to this new book in 2025, I had this idea that eventually the know-how would get dispersed, and places in India or Saudi Arabia or Vietnam, and especially in the U.S., would start to produce their own solar because they can do whatever China had done to put together the machines and optimize the supply chain and produce them. But China's just found a way to keep making solar cheaper and cheaper. And so it's been way more of a moving target than I would have expected. And so for the whole world, in a lot of ways, it's incredible because that $30,000 system is now $10,000 and will go to $5,000. So that's been beneficial for the rest of the world. There are concerns, though, about having such a core technology being mostly produced in one place. And so a lot of the effort in the last, I would say 3 or 4 years for the U.S. to develop its own supply chain and produce its own solar has been bearing some fruit and has been growing. And it's not at the scale of China. It's still small. But the fact that we have a potential to grow a industry in the U.S., I think could be very helpful for countering that. But I also think that production eventually will start to move away from China to other places. And we're already having a lot of solar produced in places like Vietnam and Malaysia, and to some extent in the U.S.
Silicon, the primary input material for these solar modules. Can the U.S. get that type of material, efficiently, quickly, and at the right price?
Yeah, material is no problem with solar. We can make it. We're basically using sand to make silicon chips, and quartz, and we're using sand to make glass. And glass is the biggest component of solar. Silicon's kind of the core technology to convert the sunlight to electricity. So, and then there's copper and aluminum and other things. There's nothing exotic in solar. There's nothing toxic, and there's nothing rare. And that's different from wind turbines. It's different from electric vehicles and batteries. So solar really does not have these constraints about materials that others do. And so that's not something we have to worry about in the U.S. It's more just assembling the manufacturing capability to make the raw material, the purified silicon, and then to process it into solar cells and to modules.
We're seeing the Trump administration roll back subsidies for solar energy, for energy programs. And it's interesting because you wrote about how President Reagan made cuts to our country's solar program in 1981. And it made me wonder, do you see parallels now under the Trump administration with cuts to clean energy programs?
Great to have that question, because I just think it's so, to me, important to use our history and experience to inform what we've got today. And so I think there are parallels and there are limitations of that comparison. So first of all, the parallel is what happened after 1981. So we invested hugely in solar in the 1970s. And then after the Reagan election in 1981, we cut the solar R&D budget by 85% within a couple of years. And so that's kind of what's been happening now in terms of cutting the subsidies for solar and the research spending as well. What happened in the 80s is that the frontier of innovation went elsewhere. It went to Japan and eventually Germany and eventually China, because that's where the innovation was, that's where the support was, and eventually that's where the markets were. And so on one hand, that would be my biggest concern right now is for solar, but a lot of other clean energy technologies that are just growing. There's huge demand for them around the world, that gets met by other countries rather than the U.S. And so that's a concern and definitely historical parallels. The difference is that there's a lot more momentum with the industry now than there was in 1981. So it's big, it's mature, it's several percent of global electricity supply. There's big companies involved. And so there isn't the sense that we can just cut off clean energy the way we really did in 1981. So there's momentum behind it. The recent policies are going to slow down the growth in the U.S., but they won't slow down the growth in the rest of the world, and they won't stop growth in the U.S. But it's also a point where we need to be speeding up our deployment of solar and clean energy technologies. And that's where I really do have concerns, because these policies are taking away support and will slow things down.
Another takeaway, you say that we need more than just solar. We need other technologies in the mix, in the energy mix. I mean, what lessons can we take away from the solar industry that could be applied to other green energies or technologies that could play well with solar?
Solar works a lot better when you've got friendly other technologies. We've got wind power that's great because when it's sunny and it's windy are usually at different times, so that can work well together. You can build transmission that links those together. Batteries help a lot because you can store energy and use it later in the day, so that helps a lot. And then just using information technology and sensors and smart devices can move energy around, or you use energy at different times so that when it's available, you use more of it. So that all helps. And those other technologies also need support. And what we've found with solar is that there's some combination of you want to focus on the improving the technology, so sometimes called technology push. That can be R&D, it can be education, research and science, new materials, getting people smart on what the frontier of innovation is. So that's part of it. The other side of it is markets. And that's where we want to actually have demand for things like solar, like electric vehicles, like wind turbines, like smart devices, and other technologies we might need. And that's the part that's moved away in the last 6 months. And that's what the U.S. is really leading on, was having these kind of small initial markets for solar, for wind, for electric vehicles, and then other things like advanced nuclear reactors and other technologies that could be very useful. And that part I'm concerned about, because that part we're missing in a lot of our clean energy innovation right now, the market side where we actually have customers for these technologies.
I wonder if that is where the pessimism has been lurking about solar's potential, because you talk about how there were a lot of people who are just thumbs down on solar, but that could also be changing.
Yeah, I mean, solar, it's changing in that it's becoming more mainstream. It's not as exotic. It's becoming more affordable, and it's working well because this whole system is getting better designed to use it. And also we have other models. We can look to places like Australia, like Germany, like Spain, like Chile, where they're not having problems with keeping the lights on, even though they're using sometimes 50% solar at certain times. So there's a lot of reasons why we should expect solar will continue and will grow. It's just we're taking some of the support away from that movement at a time when we really need to be accelerating it and pushing it and taking advantage of this resource that we now have that we didn't have 10 years ago. So I think that's where we're really squandering an opportunity.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Good talking to you about it.
Greg Nemeth is a professor in the La Follette School of Public Affairs at UW-Madison, author of How Solar Energy Became Cheap, Pathway to a Solar-Centric Economy. His new book is a history of solar energy and an exploration for how it's become inexpensive. Coming up, the road to Middle Earth starts in Oshkosh. Find out how a Wisconsin mapmaker created a legendary atlas for the Lord of the Rings as a new exhibit of her work kicks off.
She started building this huge base map on the floor of the kitchen, using kitchen tiles as scale because it was so big.
That's next here on WPR News. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. A few months back, we highlighted the career of Karen Wynne Fonstad, a cartographer from Oshkosh. She created a series of maps of the world of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, among the most popular book and movie series ever made. Fonstad spent years completely mapping J.R. Tolkien's world, and she eventually published 172 hand-drawn maps in her 1981 Atlas of Middle-earth. She's passed away, but her son Mark and her husband Todd are working to preserve her maps and her legacy. Rob Ferret talked to them a few months back as Mark was scanning many of her maps at UW-Madison's map library. Mark Fonstad sent us a follow-up email this month. Since that interview aired, a lot of people have been asking the map library if they could see the maps. And now they can in a public exhibition of the original drafts of Karen's iconic maps. It's called Fantastic Worlds, a cartographic exploration of the works of fantasy mapmaker Karen Wynne Fonstad. It opens to the public today at UW-Madison, runs through August 1st, and Mark will do a public presentation followed by an open house this Thursday at 5:30. With that exhibit launching, we're resharing Rob's conversation with Mark Fonstad and Todd Fonstad.
Mark, you and I were just over at the UW Map Library looking at some of the books she worked from. Can you talk about, before we get to the maps themselves, some of the artifacts you have gathered there that she took notes in and notes on?
Yeah, she reread the Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books many, many times, and she would take notes. She would underline phrases and sentences and paragraphs that had specific geographic information, because I think what was in her head for quite a while was the idea of making an enormous map of Lord of the Rings. It was going to be, in order to have everything on it that people would be interested in, such a map would have to be enormous, like something that would fill up an entire wall. Things got even more complicated because Tolkien's son, Christopher, later published the book The Silmarillion in the 70s. And that was also one of those artifacts. I think my dad actually found it at the store and bought it for her.
Yes.
And she went through the whole game again, reread and read that, and realized very quickly that it would be impossible to make one big map that had everything. That's when the idea of the atlas came about.
Now, Mark, we were just looking at these maps. This is a challenge, right? You're taking text descriptions of a world and some maps drawn by J.R. Tolkien's son, Christopher, but translating that print information into a map. Can you talk about how she took it from the page to the maps we'll see and people can see online?
So the first step in any large atlas project is building something called a base map. This is an enormous map that has just very simple things on it, like where are the coastlines or the rivers or the mountains. And in the case of the Atlas of Middle-earth, that base map, she was lucky because some of that information already existed in maps published in the books. Tolkien had died a couple of years earlier, so she wasn't able to work with him directly. But because she had some of these basic maps, she had a place to start. And from that, she started building this huge base map on the floor of the kitchen, using kitchen tiles as scale because it was so big. And from that, she would then add information that she had read in the books, like the river went this way, or the forest was there or not there. And once you complete a base map, then it becomes a lot easier to take smaller areas and make more and more detailed maps. So you kind of go through these books line by line and add information.
And Todd, it's not like she went to the Houghton Mifflin map room and was working. This is a home project. Can you talk about what this looked like at home when Middle-earth basically invaded your household?
Well, she was very handy. She had a father who operated a shop, sheet metal. I had a brother that was very good at diagramming. She learned how to use tools, how to diagram. Of course, everything was by hand. So she actually built a light table with her tools. I think Mark's got it in his house right now. But it was on a drafting table, and she put the light table under that and put it up in our office on the second floor. And so it eventually migrated from the kitchen floor to upstairs, where she could work till 4 a.m.
And Mark, you grew up surrounded by Middle-earth and other fantasy worlds. So did I. My folks bought a copy of the Atlas. They were huge Lord of the Rings fans, as was I in the day. Todd, can you talk about the reception, how people received this new look at Middle-earth? And I don't know, I think there is a fandom for her work.
I think she would be utterly surprised, to say the least, to see how this has ballooned. She never did this for money or for fame. It was her passion. Frankly, the royalties didn't come in much until the end of her life. So she didn't do it for that, and it's amazing now it's being published in at least a dozen other countries.
We're talking about Wisconsin cartographer Karen Wynne Fonstad. She's famous for her Atlas of Middle-earth, mapping the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and other fantasy maps. Fonstad passed away 20 years ago this month. We're joined by her husband, Todd Fonstad, and Mark Fonstad, her son, both geographers themselves. Mark, I want to get into the project you're working on now. You've gathered a bunch of the material that your dad had on hand. You're visiting from Oregon in Madison right now, and you're scanning these. Talk about this project.
For many years, both my father and I have thought that it would be really useful and good to find a place to have a long-term archive of my mother's work. And we haven't looked into that in detail yet, but one of the first steps in doing that is to scan and index the maps so that you can show people what would exist, what sorts of things would be in such an archive. And it's a little bit of an overwhelming process because, first of all, there's hundreds of maps. Secondly, the maps are built in such a way as they have many layers to them, in a way that you would have layers of a project you're working on in Photoshop, but these are actual physical layers. So any individual map takes multiple scans. And I've been working all week on a large machine to scan some of my mother's maps, and I've barely scratched the surface this week.
When we were just over at the map library, a young cartographer stumbled into our conversation and realized that this was Karen Wynne Fonstad's work strewn all over about the library on tables, and I think he just about passed out. He was very excited.
So are you a fan?
I'm literally trying to make a 21st century follow-up on her map on Numenor from Lord of the Rings.
You want to take a look?
Is this happening right now? I am friends with like 6 Tolkien mega fans online across the world who would actually, not literally kill, but go to really extreme lengths just to see this, what I blundered into.
She would have been a rock star if she went to, I think, science fiction conventions, fantasy role-playing game conventions. That wasn't her scene, though.
No, in fact, I don't know if that she did really hardly any of that until very late in her life. It wasn't until Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies that she kind of got out of her skin and went to some of those conventions. And I think she was quite taken aback by the public interest in her and her work at the time, because when she was working on these projects, mostly in the 1980s, she said, I could have been on a desert island. It was just her and her maps and her light table and the drafting pins, and that was basically it.
And she was in the zone. She would lose complete track of time. She was always on the go. One of her favorite sayings was, can't, never did anything. And she told me many, many times, I've got this neat idea. And she was always thinking, not only atlases, but anything she did, very much with a passion. She was not a patient person.
She was a constantly creative person. If she wasn't mapping, she was trying to think of something else creative to do, like I'm going to build shelves in my bedroom today or something like that. I think she had a kind of innate need.
So I totally get the fascination with fantasy maps. I always have loved them in fiction, games, whatever. And I can't put my finger on why. What is it about fantasy maps that fascinated Karen and so many other people?
That's a hard question. I think it's the same kind of question about why would people read fantasy books anyway. And because they're not tied directly to the real world, you can put yourself into it a lot more, and people obviously do that. And it works even better if that fantasy world has rules that you can understand. That this world is like a little bit like the world you are interested in, and so people spend a lot of time trying to think about these alternate worlds as real.
One of her rules was that she could write about fantasy worlds, but those worlds always had to be based on our reality. You can't go too far out in your fantasies. So there had to be a reflection of the real world here.
That reminds me, speaking of the real world, one of the maps you showed me was the fantasy landmark of Oshkosh, Wisconsin.
Yeah. My mother was never a full-time cartographer. She would do projects when they came around. She would do D&D module now or a book there, but she would also be working as a physical therapist or a lecturer at the university for teaching cartography. And so, for example, she would do projects that to other people might seem more mundane, like let's update the map of Oshkosh, but she was a cartographer. That's what you do.
For years, she was a member of the Oshkosh Planning Commission. She was very civic-minded. She spent a term on the Common Council. She was very active in church. She was always on the go. And it wasn't until, I would say, the last 5 or 6 months of her life that, I never saw her. She didn't slow down until the last few months of her life.
Now, Todd, our producer, Beatrice, is very curious about the dedication to the 1991 edition of the Atlas of Middle-earth to you, the family. It reads, "To Todd, Mark, and Christy, still pilous, who have shared my 10 years of trials and triumphs from Middle-earth." What does that mean, still pilous, Todd?
Oh, that's a funny one, because I think she felt that she was slighting the family in some ways by all this work, and that she wasn't baking enough pies or bread or whatever.
If you look in the original version of the Atlas of Middle-earth, I can't remember exactly what it says, but instead of still pilous, it says something to my pilous.
Oh, okay. That was
So that's a revision. So it's kind of her joke.
How funny.
Yeah.
And Mark, as we wrap up, I mean, very influential map making your mom did, a resource for the film adaptation. I can see when I look at role-playing game maps, the influence of your mom. Can you talk a little bit about her legacy in the world of fantasy map making?
So the world of not only fantasy map making for professional purposes, like you would see in Peter Jackson's movies, but also just a kind of fan fiction level fantasy cartography is a real huge niche these days. There are lots and lots of people making fantasy cartography. And I look back into the sort of history of fantasy cartography, which existed long before Tolkien even, but there's nothing like it is today. Today, there's far more of it. And part of that is the technology exists to make it easier to do. But even with that technology, people spend a lot of time looking at my mother's work as a kind of benchmark. Like, this is how fantasy maps ought to look in some respect. And so if you go ask people who do as a hobby fantasy cartography, my mother's work is often the very first thing that comes up, which is I think she would be very happy about that.
Absolutely.
And we'll leave it there. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And Todd, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
That was Mark and Todd Fonstad, geographers and family of the late Wisconsin cartographer Karen Wynne Fonstad. She's known for her detailed maps of fantasy worlds, especially the 1981 Atlas of Middle-earth. An exhibit of Fonstad's work opens today on the UW-Madison campus. It's called Fantastic Worlds, a cartographic exploration of the works of fantasy mapmaker Karen Wynne Fonstad, and it runs through August 1st. The Brewers have been on such a hot streak, and we're catching that hint of optimism in the air among fans about how the Brew Crew is defying expectations. Tomorrow on the show, we're checking in with the sports director at WISN TV in Milwaukee about the mood in the dugout and the Miz on the mound. And we want to hear from you. How do you feel about this run? What do you make of this rookie pitcher phenom, Jacob Mizorowski, taking the league by storm? Do you go to games in the summer? What do you love about summer baseball? Share your thoughts. Email wisconsintoday@wpr.org. Or you can call or text. The number is 888-642-0232. Once again, that's 888-642-0232. Wisconsin Today producers include Mackenzie Crummy, Joe Tarr, and Beatrice Lawrence. Our technical directors are Sarah Hopeful and Tyler Ditter. Learn more about us at wpr.org/Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer Kent. You're listening to WPR News.